Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about exchange zones. We're going to find all about what those are later. I'd never heard the term before. There's a track and field reference in there, which we're going to get to as well. So Miles Mufuka Martin, joining us from where? Where are you based? Where are you today?
I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania right now.
Okay, beautiful. I knew you were on the East Coast. I just wasn't sure exactly where, so I probably should have known that. We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of things today and actually getting back to a topic that I quite love and have been pretty fond about for a few years. And in fact, a term we don't really even hear anymore, this idea of collaborative consumption and sharing economy and some of these ideas. So before we get into all this space and get into the subject matter as we always do, Miles, welcome to the show. Just give us a 2-second soundbite on you and where you're from and where we're coming from, and then we can dive into it.
Yeah, I am Miles Mufuka Martin. I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and go Steelers. I lead. I helped lead and co-found a company called Relai. Ran track and field during undergrad, and so those are some. I also grew up playing soccer. I played that in undergrad as well. So sports tech, absolutely. Yep.
And so we don't normally diverge so quickly, but we're going to. Do you see those things as related? Is there crossover from a skill set perspective or a focus perspective?
Skill set, I think it really depends on like person to person, but I think at large, I think there's a larger risk tolerance.
Interesting.
I think it's more about like how people have been conditioned. There's something about throwing up and bleeding in front of your friends and family that like, I think I can take the risk elsewhere too, you know?
Wow, I've never really considered that. My older brother ran, I guess what you would call track and field. He was doing like 400 and 800 meter and 1500 kind of distances to the point of making himself sick. I didn't expect us to be talking about vomit at the 2-minute mark, but we're here, so this is where we are. But the idea that would then reduce your barriers and concerns about yourself such that you would take other risks is a really interesting idea. It's very, very fascinating. Cool. All right, let's dive in. So there's a whole bunch of ways we can come at this, and I might not be starting in the right place, but I'm going to start here anyway because I think about a decade ago, or maybe even a bit more, we started to see the emergence of a whole bunch of different economic models that basically said the current system of consumption is somewhat inefficient. And the examples I'm going to give are the obvious ones, kind of Uber and Lyft in the US, Uber probably for anywhere else in the world and whatever your regional variant is, and Airbnb would agree, where we had this idea of sharing economy and collaborative consumption to say not everyone needs to own the thing. And I kind of want to understand where we're up to, because what's interesting about that for me is it kind of limits us to a certain set of assets, houses and cars, but ignores a whole maybe what you would call long tail of other assets that we maybe don't all need to own. And I think a lot of people have kind of thought, well, we don't all need to own a lawnmower. We don't all need to own a baby seat. I've literally got one at the moment, which I'm about to change over. And like, what's the current state of kind of the sharing economy and collaborative consumption as you guys see it?
Yeah, the sharing economy is becoming less of a choice to many consumers. And that is understanding that the macro circumstances is that the world is getting more expensive every day. So at large, people have less cash, or more importantly, they no longer have large sums of cash at once.
Right.
Which is why we have the rise of payment plans for everyday transactions like a Klarna or an Afterpay or something.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to peer-to-peer marketplaces like the prominence of a Facebook marketplace or the resurgence of Craigslist or things like that.
And is it kind of that we're at a place where this is happening organically because of price pressures, do you think? Or is there a little bit of that this is so normalized now that our willingness to get onto Facebook and, sell a baby seat, in my case, car seat, is kind of where we're at as a society?
I think it's both. And the reason I think it's both is because we are living in a multi-generational landscape now more than ever. People are living longer. So you're literally having more generations exist at the same time. So you have people who grew up digital natives from people who grew up iPad natives
Right.
versus people who remember the first time they went on www.
Or still
Okay.
remember a fixed line, I think is the other joke.
Exactly.
And like just sort of coming back to this idea of collaborative consumption then, specifically around physical objects, right? So like moving past the idea of a service being, I don't need to own a car because I can just order a Lyft or an Uber, or instead of going to a hotel, I'm going to go into someone's home. But getting down into the other end, and I would say the long tail of things that you might not need to own, or at least you might own for a period and then reuse them and resell them or just offload them. Kind of where are we up to? Is it really just like Facebook's kind of a default marketplace and that's where it's at? Or like you said that Craigslist resurgent? Tell me a little bit more about this.
Yeah. So again, complementing this larger economic trend of how do I make the most out of how I spend money? That's an overarching theme.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see items that are having first, second, third, fourth, seventh lifetime uses. So yes, we have the Facebook Marketplace, but you're painting a room in your home or apartment. You don't have the extender roller.
Right.
I'm not going to whatever tool shop I'm going to go to necessarily. Let me ask a friend.
Right.
That type of thing, right? It's not always an immediate purchase. It's like, hey, how can I best connect with my friend who lives a city or across town to use what they have in a convenient way that doesn't disrupt the daily flow?
Interesting. And so, because this kind of leads me to kind of a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which is like what stops that type of, I mean, I'm not even going to say consumption, but kind of interaction or exchange from being the norm. Like what, like if I've got a situation, I've got a lawnmower, right? In fact, I've got a right behind me here, I've got a fairly reasonable camera set up. And my first thought when I bought it, I need it for my own work, but I first thought when I bought it was who else within a 5 kilometer radius might actually need to borrow this stuff so they don't have to spend $1,500 on a camera setup as well. What's stopping this being the larger kind of exchange to be happening in the mainstream, do you think?
First thing is awareness. Having centralized places where people can look for what they want, right? The old rule of the internet that you can find whatever you're looking for online. Now, how does that extend to physical things near you? All right. So awareness, and I love this question because it's just like the evolution of the internet of saying that when it came about, it always was presented and marketed as this global tool. This is a tool. You go online, you connect digitally to connect with things beyond yourself so far away. But in the last 10, 15 years, everybody's interaction online has become increasingly localized. I'll open up Google Maps to get across town, not to drive across the country. Right?
Yep.
And so think about those data points. I'll go on a food review app or use one of these delivery services to order something nearby. I know where my McDonald's is, like I don't need to look up that, right?
Right.
And so it's that combination of like how people use digital tools is increasingly localized. But what's being presented to folks online is still very expansive.
Interesting. So to take a very specific example, let's take the example of I need to, my outcome, my job to be done, if you're going to put it in product or UX terms, is I need to take some video footage for my company or my small business or whatever it is. And the way the internet is servicing that need is to say, well, you must need a camera and we can sell you one from anywhere in the world and get it to you. And someone's thought process is, well, I don't know, do I need to buy one? I mean, I just need to use one. I need to use it for 4 hours. Oh, okay, well, we can find you a human in your area who could do that for you. Well, I don't need someone to do it. I'm happy to do it myself. I know how to operate a camera. I'm just shooting stuff for my home business, for the proverbial bake sale. So the gap here is in this discovery of physical objects around in sort of localized areas that solve whatever the job to be done is. Because the thought process now for this macro you're talking about is I shouldn't need to buy this thing just to achieve the task I'm trying to achieve. Why wouldn't I just be able to get use of it?
And I think this is a legacy item of the internet. When you go on Google at the bottom, it still shows you how many results it brings back.
Right.
That was impressive back in 1996. Like, but because we now have 20 years of data that shows nobody goes past the second page,
Right.
most people don't go past halfway down.
Right.
So it's, again, why are they showing me the billions of possibilities when that's not our behaviors at this point?
Mm. And so translate this for me into kind of how you're thinking about this at Relay, because, and we'll talk about the exchange zones in a second, but you obviously see an opportunity based on some of these large macros and kind of what's been normalized in other bigger purchase items, as an example, in terms of not having to own a car. How are you thinking about that flowing down the curve, and then where are you guys starting to play, and what kind of problems and barriers to adoption are you having to solve as a result?
Yeah, what we see most immediately is, what are the platforms that are connecting people in that 3-kilometer radius, like you said, like 3-5 kilometers? Who is out there telling people what's nearby?
Mm-hmm.
And then how can we support those interactions? That's where our thought process begins. And so for a Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, you need to buy a new like a new car seat. Okay, let's start there. You have a new car seat. Who has a car seat that their children has outgrown? And then we think about, how do people go about interacting and actually accessing the thing? And I think what's important here is that we're not talking about payment. Okay? We are not talking about how to exchange payment. There are tons of tools out there for how people can pay for stuff. But how do we actually physically go and achieve the item?
Yep.
And so that's where we started our process. That's what we were thinking of, like, all right, payment is there, and there are platforms that are aggregating localized need. They can be better. They could definitely be better, but that is there. What are the alternatives, and what are people doing right now? And so right now, people are either just meeting strangers in whatever place that two strangers can agree upon. They're using shipping services. Like, they're using major shipping services to go across town.
Right. Like a FedEx or a UPS or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. They are using a FedEx to ship 7 miles across to the other side of town. And that's just inconvenient. And that's actually not what those services were designed to service.
Mm.
And then they're doing a whole bunch of other cool stuff, which is, can I trust a nearby store to just leave it at the counter and I'll attach a sticky note for somebody else to come pick it up?
That's happening. That's people hacking the solution that way to say, I don't want to meet this person. I don't feel safe, or like, I don't want to put myself out there. I'm happy to buy the thing. How do you get around I'm getting into practical, but I'm curious about this part. If someone wanted to buy this baby seat that I have because I don't need it and I need to get a booster seat because my kid's getting older, how does someone look at the object to work out if they want to buy it? Is that part of the challenge here, or how does that play out?
That is not part of the challenge. People have gotten really comfortable and, they've built up the habit to look at photos, trying to tell quality through photos, how to filter through authentic reviews. I think the average consumer can tell, oh no, that review's a robot. This sounds like a person,
Right.
And then we obviously have a preference from a high quality image versus a lower quality image.
Yeah.
So those consumer habits we don't have to account for at this stage.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting as well, because I think ultimately 15 years ago, people weren't happy to go and stay in someone else's home. They're like literally their personal home. We kind of normalized that behavior. And I think I'll take the example of this car seat, the one that I don't need anymore probably cost me about $500. The one that I probably need to get as a booster is probably going to cost about $50 or less than. If I get it not new, it'll be under $100 probably. But I'll also be happy to offload the one that I have for probably around that amount, if that. I've got no use for it. And so the risk for someone getting a $20 or $50 car seat that would have cost $500 new is actually quite low. If the thing looks good and the photos look good and the reviews look good, you're like, there's not a lot of risk here. That's sort of the thesis.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a few sources that do confirm it, both in the field and academically, but like that, you are spot on. That is the wave.
Yeah. And so how does that translate to, where you guys are starting to play from a pure kind of, going to the solution? Right up before we talked about this, you talked about being in the lab and having to come up with a solution to this problem of exchange. Let's talk a bit about the product because I'm curious about it and I have some questions about it as well.
Yeah. So we came up with exchange zones, and exchange zones are convenient locations with secure compartments. And using a mobile app, you tap a couple buttons, those compartments open, you can store what you want inside, and you can pick it up later yourself or send a link for somebody else to come pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the core. Like, not to oversell it, we've written millions of lines of code, but what do? We open the door at these unique compartments at multiple places.
Well, my first question, obviously, what's the code doing? I mean, not that I'm a tech coder per se, but like, what were some of the technical challenges that needed to be solved to be able to make that as simple as pull up an app and open a door?
Yeah, so our product definitely falls in line with like the IoT hardware type of space.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point in time, it's just a lot of work to communicate from one physical device through a software to another physical device. It's the fact that we have to actually know our way around hardware, firmware, and software just makes the base lift a bit larger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the basic thought process here is all of the components should exist, but getting the components to work in a cohesive way is the art and the magic. So just getting back to this in the lab comment, when you guys are building the solution, actually, I want to play back what the solution is. Solution is essentially a form of storage locker, if you like that is big enough to be able to handle most things that might be exchanged in this manner. So what's the exact dimension of it? Like a single locker?
A single, yes. a single compartment is roughly about 2.5 feet wide.
Okay. But 2.5 by 2.5 or by 4 or something. Yeah.
More, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then the large unit? Yeah. And the larger unit, the whole unit itself?
The whole tower, that's the language we use. The whole tower is about 6 feet high.
Yeah. All right, cool. Couple of meters high. And then they're stackable, right? That you're able to actually have similar ones put together. And
yeah, I like to use the Lego analogy, saying functionally we can mix and match however we want. We have a standard configuration, but they're like Legos. We can.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. So there's a bunch of hardware here. This stuff all has to talk to each other. There's a bunch of software to get all that to work. I'm curious, and we'll go into some of the practicalities of actually how you roll that network out and make that network available. But coming back to kind of the consumer transaction, like, what you said right up front is there's a discovery piece, right? Someone might use Marketplace or Craigslist to find the good. There's a whole bunch of payment solutions. You don't need to solve that. How is this then connected into kind of the Relai experience? Like, how do they think or know to use Relai? Like, how do you bridge that gap from pure an awareness perspective? How are people finding out about it?
Yeah, right now we have a pretty bottom-up marketing approach. We are connecting with influencers, for lack of a better word, on those platforms I talked about.
Sure.
So you go to Facebook, there are a bunch of buy, sell, trade Facebook groups.
Right.
We'll go to an admin and be like, hey, will you advocate for this replacement or substitution for the in-person process? Or will you just incorporate us into your group rules and best practices? That's one thing. And then we collaborate with our location host. So these things have to sit on specific properties and sites. And so we collaborate with those site owners and managers to be like, hey, how can driving traffic to this particular unit, this particular exchange zone, help out your other goals?
Right. And let's talk a bit about that, because I'm curious about like where you made in some of the collateral on the website, you talk about any place that you might get an ATM or be comfortable putting an ATM. Although, by the way, in Australia, ATMs are starting to disappear because people are like, I don't need cash, so I don't need ATMs, interestingly enough. So there's going to be a lot of spaces for relays, which is awesome. But curiously, like, what type of organization is it typically that says, I've got this amount of space and this is the type of infrastructure that will benefit my business? How does that work?
Yeah. There are a few different buckets that location hosts have fallen into so far. I think one more obvious example is like restaurants, to be like, hey, let's put this here. And the benefit for you is that we have an increased foot traffic.
Yeah.
So I come to pick up that booster seat and you happen to see the menu and be like, oh, I'll come here. Or let me grab let me grab something to go.
Mm.
Or it might be more particular. It might be, we have an exchange zone at a comedy club.
Right.
Okay. So we have an exchange zone at a comedy club and it's well lit. It's great visibility. It's like a very safe spot in the neighborhood.
Mm.
So people feel comfortable going to it. But then for their night event, that comedy club uses it for bag storage and quick storage for all the attendees.
Interesting. This
So
was
we
going to
have
be
that
one of my,
multi-use.
yeah, this is going to be one of my questions because I think about, like in Australia right now, as an example, and I think this is true in the US as well, there's PO boxes, like traditional PO box, and I get one and it's mine and I'm the only person who gets to use it and I have a key and it's, 1858 all over again, right? So you have, that type of infrastructure. And I don't know if this is the case in the US, but Australia Post, which is kind of like our USPS equivalent, have these kind of shared boxes now, and you can get stuff delivered to those because you live in an apartment and you don't want stuff left out the front. There isn't a box there to put anything decent in. And so what's emerging is this kind of improved infrastructure for getting stuff sent to a place that you can access it at a time of your choosing, and you kind of have a window to be able to access it. But for me, the evolution of that feels like, why would they need to be part of the mailing infrastructure? Why wouldn't they just be part of the infrastructure generally? And why do they need to live in post office if they could live in comedy clubs? Is that a real example, by the way? Is that actually one of the comedy clubs?
That's a real example.
I love it. I love it. So like, is that kind of how you're thinking about this? Isn't just about, people on marketplace who are trying to, get a booster seat, but actually about the exchange of goods generally within local areas?
It is about that hyper-local exchange of goods.
Yeah.
And you did mention the postal services and shipping like packages. I believe that there is a need for a distinction between how we move things locally versus what our traditional logistics roadmaps are.
Mm.
And at this point in time, that's mainly because of volume.
Right.
Saying that there is a tremendous volume and larger supply chains, they just need to be reimagined altogether. That is another conversation for another time. But like, there's so much volume coming from online orders, online e-commerce orders as is, that they do need dedicated infrastructure.
Mm.
That infrastructure should be more efficient, but they do need dedicated infrastructure. And your local supply chains, me across town, I need different infrastructure than going from warehouse to home.
Mm. Yeah. A thing that I think and I kind of wrote this down before coming onto the interview, which is, I think about what TransferWise did 10 years ago, whenever it was that TransferWise, and now called Wise, but they basically had a solution for payments that realized sending money across borders is a pain in the butt, right? And the reason it's a pain in the butt is because you have to send it from your bank to this other bank, and you have to use all of this 40-plus-year-old infrastructure, Swift networks and whatever to do it. And what they had as a solution instead was to say, you know what, give it to us and we will move one big transaction from Australia to the US, to take this example. And then once it's in the US, then we'll distribute it to the people individually. And so it's kind of like one big line to take the thing for the major part of its journey, and then a bunch of hyper-local transactions on either side, and that's happening on a daily basis. And when I think about how objects move around generally, I almost look at that and say, well, that feels like a way you could solve moving objects around as well. I don't need something to come to my home. I just need it to come somewhere near me. I'm happy to pick it up from somewhere, but why charge me $18 to get it to my home when you could probably get it to a centralized location for $5 and save me an extra $11? I know you're not necessarily solving that, but I think there's overlap with how you're thinking about your challenges. So
absolutely. And there are the U.S. consumers,
yeah,
there's definitely a preference for ship to home. That isn't in Australia, that isn't in Europe, that isn't in Eastern Asia. That is unique, but at large, I definitely agree. And the other thing I want to bring up is like, that's not a sustainable, or there needs to be a more sustainable lens on it to say, we're at a point where we all have so much stuff and there is a lot of stuff near you. And so we're not at a point at the large, any community, any city, like the odds of you needing immense volume of new stuff, very low. And so that is just perfect timing with people saying, I have less cash. How can I have an alternative?
Yeah. And so then the thinking here is like, if you want to, red ocean, blue ocean type strategy thinking, if you want to grow the amount of reuse, that's not maybe not so much collaborative consumption where we're both using the same thing at the same time, which might be a Airbnb or a Lyft, but I don't need this thing anymore and I am happy to offload it to someone else, and I will 5 out of the 6 things I buy next month could also be bought in the same way. The thought process here from a Relai perspective is you have to solve this local infrastructure interchange problem specifically for this type of consumption to promote and to support this type of consumption.
Absolutely. And that infrastructure comment, I do see it as that play. Like you have to create that bottom-up localized infrastructure. And then once it's there, people will gain more flexibility. Whether you're a marketplace seller, a comedy club, you're just taking the transit, like whatever your use case ends up being, but you need the thing there for that use to actually arise.
Yeah. And so is there a bit of the comedy club is such an interesting example for me because like it's the last place where I would expect to go and pick up a thing. But then once it's there, I'd think, of course, it makes sense. It's like 2 minutes down the road, it's well lit to your point. Like what are the other parts, like what are the other places that you think are going to be looking at this saying, well, we need this for whatever reason, so we're happy to be a host. Like what's in it for the hosts and how does that play out?
Yeah, what I'm grateful for, and it has just tripled my workload, is all of the different interests we get, because one thing about the hardware itself is that we don't need to be bolted in. We don't need an Ethernet connection, and there are no wires.
Right.
So no Ethernet, no outlet, no bolting.
Right.
It's truly we can drop and go.
Right.
And the thing's about a half a ton, so like you're not going to just move it casually either. So
right.
That's part of the reason the ATM example exists. Some interesting locations that we have today are like nonprofit looking for a way to accept donations. Because very quickly in that nonprofit space, a lot of office space or programmatic space becomes temporary warehouses when they have a Christmas drive or something like that.
Right.
Versus a retail example. We'll go to one of these open air like malls or commercial strips. And then those stores are like, hey, I close at 9, but let's say somebody comes in late. Or the coffee shop has typical coffee hours that they close at 3 in the afternoon. But restaurants buy their coffee bags by the Bing or what have you. Parks, we're onboarding a new location right now and they're just a local park. And so they have soccer games and like rugby games and all of the things at the park facilities. And the coaches asked for a way to distribute uniforms without having to wait up for parents to come by. So I don't have a clear answer for you right now. We are still processing data to see what takes the largest chunk.
Yeah, it was less about the kind of the data on where it's going to land, but I think and I've referenced this I think previously on the show, but there's a Garfield cartoon, and I'm not a big Garfield fan because I think it's fairly lowbrow and monotonous in the basics of it. But there's a particular frame where the dog Odie climbs a tree. And then Garfield, who's a cat, can climb the tree, and they're both sitting up on a branch together. And John, the owner of these two animals, comes along and says, "What are you doing, Odie? How did you get in a tree? Didn't you know dogs can't climb trees?" And Garfield's thought bubble is it's amazing what you can do when you don't know what you can't do. And I kind of hark back to this because I think in the examples that you just provided of a person who has a coffee shop who's trying to leave some beans for one of their regulars who picks up their beans but doesn't finish work till 6 o'clock at night, or the coach who doesn't want to have to hang around and try to hand these things out. These are all examples of interchange that's happening in a local environment that we just take for granted involves someone having to do a bunch of work that, is inefficient and could be far more easily done in a asynchronous fashion, i.e. at different times, rather than a synchronous fashion. And like for me, it's kind of starting to open an eye of this isn't just about someone wanting a babysit on Marketplace, but someone actually at any point where you're interchanging anything locally, why would you need to meet that person in person if you didn't need to?
It's spot on. It's spot on. And I'm going to use that Garfield example. I'm gonna tuck it away. That's good. Man, I think people appreciate the change in flow, right? It's that moment of, if I had an alternative that was asynchronous that I trusted,
right,
would I use it consistently? right now, those alternatives aren't present in the mainstream.
Right.
And so the choice is people making the best of what they have, whether it is meeting a stranger wherever they can find time and place to do that, trying to address feelings of safety.
Yeah.
Or, asking with their bank to leave it there, whatever the case is. I think people are reconciling the best they can with what's available.
Yeah. I mean, I find it an absolutely fascinating idea. I just think it feels to me like I remember when a guy who I've had a business relationship with for over 13 years, and I got back from the US and I was like, hey, you should try this ride sharing thing. And he's like, he was very dismissive of it. He's old school. He's not on LinkedIn. He's done very well for himself, and he's done that despite not being, massively tech forward in any way, although he would like to be. And I remember I was catching up with him about a month later, and he was like, oh, this thing is amazing. And he showed it to me. I'm like, dude, I told you about it. I know how it works, right? But what was interesting about it was that how quickly his behavior changed when he found a thing that was infinitely better. And if, in the way I look at kind of the Lyft and Uber example, I was a really early rider with Lyft. I was in San Francisco when it launched. We knew the guys when they were Zimride before they became Lyft. And I was like, probably in the first month of its operation, I was a passenger at Lyft. So I got a really early look at it. And what sort of struck me that was interesting, which I think has some parallels here, just coincidentally, not just because it's collaborative, is that they took the 4 or 5 major moments in the comparative solution, being a taxi, that sucked, and they made those moments good. So if you think about a taxi, back in the day, it was a pain in the butt. You had to ring up and wait on hold, and could be 30 minutes before you even got spoken to. Waiting for it sucked. Now you've called it, you think it's coming, you have no idea if it's coming or not. You're out in the street, you're trying to work out if that's the one. Another one goes past, it's not your one. Maybe they're just not going to come. Being in it sucked, right? It was just, they were loud or noisy or they weren't clean or whatever the problem was, and paying for it sucked. All of that was just horrendous. And they took those 4 moments and made those 4 better. If you think about Relai, what are your 3 or 4 moments, and how do you reimagine those moments in this kind of construct?
Yeah. What's top of mind for me is the asynchronicity of it, right? You don't have to be in person at the same time.
Right.
And if quarantine through a pandemic hasn't emphasized that point yet, all right, like this is the moment to get on the wave.
Right.
So assessing what asynchronous means for how you address a need, that's like key for me. And then that bleeds into convenience, right? You're on Facebook Marketplace to get the car seat booster. You're not there to meet a new friend online. Right. There are other platforms for that, So it's the convenience. It's the asynchronous part. And I think both of those will really just, I guess one more is, we're not trying to replace existing habits right now. Like, I think it would be intuitive to try to go build our own Facebook Marketplace and then try to get people to use exchange zones that way.
Right.
But we chose not to do that. We're like, hey, those platforms exist. Let's become a post-sale tool for them. People can find what they need, use the thing, do the payments that they have been doing, and then use us, right? And so that's another thing, is that we're not interrupting other habits.
Yeah.
This is a new habit.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you've broken a larger transaction into a discrete chunks and said 2 out of these 3 are already kind of okay. And honestly, we don't need to build a network of exchange to solve the problem of actual physical exchange. We just need to solve the actual problem of physical exchange, which I find fascinating. It was actually one of my questions before we got on today, was most of the things that I've observed that require network effects are trying to be too much to be able to solve the discrete problem that is what they went after. And, I think about a friend of mine set up what's now become Uber rideshare in Australia, and it was Uber car share. So it was a car sharing. I'm not sure what the US one's called from memory, but basically I own a car and I want to allow other people to rent it and make use of it on a day-to-day basis. And they had to solve the network problem of enabling someone in Bondi Beach to be able to borrow a car in Bondi Beach. But what they didn't have to solve was buying cars and getting drivers and doing all these things. They just had to solve, there is a car and we just need to make sure someone can rent it. What's interesting and probably, I guess, mirrors what you were talking about earlier with the hardware, is that the fundamental lever that helped them to solve it, other than being operationally incredibly good, was that they had to build a physical device to make getting into the car easier, because that was the main problem. How do you get into the damn thing, right? How do I ensure that the key that's left there is not left for the greater world, but only the person who's supposed to use it? And they ultimately solved the hardware problem to be able to solve that problem, to be able to build the network, and everything else kind of flowed from, good marketing and good operations.
And this is just another thing I think about at large. And your friend's story is a part of this conversation, is that the past 20, 25 years, software has been first and hardware has been taken for granted. And a lot of those modes are just standardized. People assumed, hey, let's work at the desktop computer. Let's work at the laptop. Let's work on a mobile phone. But like the places that software can interact are growing. And whether that was the smartwatches, whether that we see these home devices, the smart home tools come up, like people are coming on board that we need an expansion of daily hardware tools. It's just not that intimidating if you try.
Yeah, or I think we're starting to normalize this idea that the devices that you might interact with, people in their current mental model, think about their phone, think about a watch if they wear a smartwatch, think about a laptop, tablet, totally fine. Okay with an ATM, maybe with a kiosk computer, but starting to think that you're interacting with other hardware in other contexts is kind of this next kind of leap forward in kind of normalized behavior. I mean, this feels like a great example for it. I guess from where you guys are at the moment, like what's the barrier now to kind of taking over Pittsburgh as a starting point? Like, it's obviously hyper local, so you don't have to have them in every city for the whole thing to work. It only has to be in Pittsburgh. How do you think about the rollout to a market or a geography?
Yeah, so right now we're in a handful of cities, so that rollout is there. One is capital to sustain these operations, but I think the other, and most important, it's an awareness lift for our potential location host. Like, that is barrier number one, is all of the property owners, all of the diversity of property owners. How do we make them aware in an exponential fashion that they can host this themselves? Because part of our model, which is key for our growth, is that it's free to host.
Right.
Like, there's just no barrier. You just have to fill out a simple sign-up form and it'll be there in 4 to 6 weeks, So that's our biggest thing right now, is how do we get exponential awareness to the variety of property hosts and properties so that people can start to, spur their own imagination about how to use it in their daily life.
So that's curious to me, because I would have thought, like, in a standard network problem, I mean, you have to start with liquidity, right? You have to start with places where you can exchange before you can drive the behavior of exchanging. So is part of this barrier at the moment, hey, for us, let's take, how many people are there in Pittsburgh? 1.5 million?
300,000. Yeah, 300,000.
300,000. Okay, cool. So for this to work in Pittsburgh, there needs to be 15 sites or 12 or however many sites that then give it critical mass, so that anyone is within a certain define of what we would call Pittsburgh is then like, this is so convenient. I'm not going to someone's house anymore, having them come to my house or meeting in a playground. And so kind of is the thing that helps you guys get into market having enough liquidity, enough of these sites available, and then the consumer behavior kind of follows. Is that kind of how it plays out?
Not quite. And that's what we've done. We've done a lot of work on just GIS and like population statistics and densities, is that it's truly valuable at the unit level. So we can go to one neighborhood, and if it works within that one neighborhood, then that can justify going to one or two more.
Right.
So our critical mass is much, much smaller. We do not need to start with 10, 20 at a time.
Interesting, because realistically, this stuff's so hyperlocal anyway. Your argument is there's a baby seat probably within 10 kilometers or 5-7 miles or whatever it is, and you only need one in between the two of you to make that work.
And this is where just, again, like, I believe part of our privilege in starting a company at this time is that we have 2-3 decades of user data. So I can actually say that if you are in the US, 90+% of what you buy is within 4 miles of you.
Right.
Right? Like I can say that with assurance because a bunch of other people have taken the work to amass that data and glean those insights.
Yeah, it's very much about enabling this last mile. And then, so I hadn't asked, but I'm kind of now curious, like, what is the economic model?
Yeah. So we pay per transaction. That is part of the on-demand nature of this. And right now, the person who drops off an item pays per hour and then by size. So we have a standard configuration with a small, medium, and large.
Yeah.
And so those are the two components. And right now, that's $1, $2, $3, and then 50 cents an hour.
So give me a sense of it. I've got a baby seat that I have agreed to offload on Marketplace for $100. I've already done the payment. I drop it off at 10 o'clock this morning. Someone picks it up at 2 in the afternoon.
So what is that? 10, 2, that's 4 hours. So that's $2. Let's say this is a baby seat, so you'll need the large.
Yeah.
So that's $2 plus the $3. That's $5.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, totally. I figured it was that. Okay.
Yeah, but since you're on Marketplace, what we've seen people do is that they'll just bake that into what the sale is.
Yeah, absolutely. I figure if the person who's getting paid says, well, it's going to cost a certain amount, then yeah, it's an interesting model. I think my guess is just as a thought process, it will probably evolve because obviously you're testing what models actually work and the best way to structure these models for the benefit of both the buyer and the seller. But ultimately, it's a little like PayPal, right? When someone says you've got money, you go, okay, well, I'll sign up to PayPal to get the money, right? And so
yeah,
like there's a naturally build network effects into these things if you can architect the economics in the right way. And then like purely just at a curiosity level, you got a half a ton object that has to be built that has a whole bunch of electronics in it. Like what is the economics of these units over time? Like how does that stack up?
Yeah. So again, we are testing. And so I'll give you an update at our critical marks, like 5 years, 10 years, we'll see if they're still out, right? But at scale, we have an excellent hardware partner. And so they are like our relationship with them is why we can have a zero to host cost. $0 to host. Like that is a major part of this process. They're a hardware company and our relationship with them on the back end about, hey, let's commit to infrastructure and let's both share in what that means. But yeah, no, we have the scale to roll this out in mass.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I find it a fascinating thing. And I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around what are all the different possible things. I think people will surprise you in terms of what they end up using these exchange zones to do.
Man, they already have. They already have. I'm still hoping that we have a clear winner. I don't think anything will get over 50% of usage. But
no, I don't think it. I think this is the thing that's surprising about it. Like, I think about something like, like a text messaging gateway, right? That challenge in selling this and creating awareness about it is that someone will say, well, what can you do with it? And the response, intuitively is, well, anything, whatever you want. And someone's like, well, yeah, you need to tell me what I can do with it because I can't imagine that. And so I think what's going to be super interesting is starting to shine a light on these things that people are actually using it to exchange. And people are like, oh, I never thought about exchanging that through an exchange zone. Yeah, that's heaps easier than whatever it was I was exchanging and however I was doing it.
I really appreciate my my co-founder because he's really good at like acknowledging what we're good at, right? To be like, hey, we know how to build software. We know how to program IoT. We are good at locations. Like our strength will not be highlighting what these individual use cases are that catch fires. And so we've been really reliant on taking in those customer feedbacks, taking in that host feedback to spotlight them and taking momentum that way. Right? Like we're old school operators. Like let us build tech, get locations and support how you use it,
Yeah. At some point, marketing and sales becomes absolutely critical for these things. But it's fascinating. I'm curious, just like in terms of what's right in front of you right now. You just talked about locations and awareness generally. Like, what's the biggest lever now for you, or like what's holding you back? I want to understand. Like, when we come and have this conversation again in a few years' time, and you tell me you've worked out the economic model, like, what do you see is right in front of you right now? And if there's people listening, might be in the best place to help you unlock that.
Right now, it is larger relationships so that we can unlock locations exponentially, right? So to get our first 10, me and my co-founders, we originally launched in Richmond. So me and my co-founder, we went door to door asking people, can we put this here?
Right.
As you know, that's not scalable.
Yeah, sure.
But we get one local developer who owns 10 properties.
Yeah.
And now that one effort yields 10.
Mm.
And being able to grow that way and more predictably of, hey, let's go to a new city. Let's find out 10 or 20 developers in that city so we can enter with that availability for everyone. So that's our challenge in the moment, is we go to a city and we're not really available to the whole city. We're available to the 2 or 3 neighborhoods that gave us permission originally.
Mm. Yeah.
And then there's a 6-month delay after usage where everybody who walked by it is like, hey, I want one. Okay, but like we could have had that if they were aware and on board. We could have had everybody available at the same time. So that's going to be an interesting part of our growth.
Yeah, fascinating. Look, I'm excited to see where you guys land with it. I have been looking at these boxes in Australia, thinking someone should do this differently, and it was like what struck me about it. And I'm excited to see where you land. I also honestly think your economics will evolve from what it is. I think there will be some mechanism that enables the seller and the buyer to share in the convenience and, as a result, the cost associated with it. And I absolutely saw this in kind of the car sharing as well, where they realized that there's actually an economic model that kind of gives you the convenience wholesale, but also encourages the behavior you want, which is the highest turnover possible for these things to have maximum utilization. And I get there's a utilization problem. So I can't wait to see where you land with all that. And hopefully we'll see you out in Australia at some point, but also, it'd be great to come and see one in person at some point.
Absolutely. No, I'm excited because I do think this is international. That's what I also think is pretty exciting about the idea.
Yeah, I think you're conceptually onto a winner, and I think if you can crack the nut first with it, you'll attract the most capital, which will give you the most leverage to be able to get them in the most places. But yeah, not to get too far ahead. Miles, awesome having you on the show today, and I hope to see a huge amount of stratospheric growth from you guys, and hope you crack the nut and tell me all your wonderful use cases when we talk next as well.
I appreciate it. This has been great.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.